All right, so on this episode, we're going to talk about the keys to a successful private market. So let's dive right into it. Phil, what do you think are the key components that need to be in place for secondary transactions and really the private market to work?
I'd probably say the first part is just transparency across the board. Um, you've really got three customers when it comes to each private secondary transaction. You've got the investor that wants to invest in this company. You've got a shareholder, maybe it's an employee or someone like that wants liquidity. But you also have the company itself that's going to sign off on each of these transactions. What I think gets lost a lot of times is that all you've got to do is find a buyer and find a seller, and then you're all good. I think what's really important is that you're very transparent with the companies you're working with, you're transparent with the buyers and what you're doing and what you're making available, and that you can actually deliver on what you say you're going to do, which sounds kind of pedestrian and super simple, but kind of just observed over time that this space can feel like a bit of the wild, wild west sometimes. And so spending a lot of effort over the last 10 plus years on building tools that make it easier for people to communicate, to do their own research, to get these transactions done as seamlessly as possible, I think has really been kind of like the key to success so far.
So you mentioned that this market can be like the wild, wild west. What's an example of kind of how that plays out when it comes to these transactions?
Well, I could talk about that for a long time, so I'll try to give like maybe a singular example. We've talked a little bit before about how these transactions don't really happen in your brokerage account. It isn't like buying a share of IBM. There's connectivity between a buyer and a seller and the company, and it all coming together and closing. But also, it's a space where the fee structure compared to public markets is very different. It costs more money because we charge more money because there's a lot more work involved with the transactions. But it can invite some questionable actors in the space that are really motivated to try to get a trade done and make some type of commission. So when I talk about the wild, wild west, I talk about the fact that a lot of times a broker or a platform will just kind of purport that they have one side of a trade just to kind of drum up interest, right? Oh, I have shares of this company for sale. I think you'd be really interested. And they'll use that to basically get the other side of the trade to say, oh yeah, I'm a buyer of those. So here's the bid. Let's get it done. And the broker says, great. And then they take that actual bid and then they go flood the market with that actual bid to go actually try to source shares. It's like a pretty common practice. I think it can lead to a lot of frustration because there isn't disclosure and transparency about what that broker or that platform might be doing. And the reason it's even possible is because the space is really new. There isn't a clearinghouse. There isn't an exchange. These are kind of like, we call them like, maybe like an OTC trade, like over the counter type trade in public markets. There isn't like as much structure around it. And so when you have that, you basically have the wild, wild west.
So given that this is a relatively nascent market and there's room for kind of some of that wild west activity, what are some of the key decisions or I guess principles that you decided were important as you were growing EquityZen when it comes to how we behave in this market and transact?
Customer communication is probably the biggest thing, and just being very upfront with what we are going to do or what we're going to try to do or what we will not do. So as an example, if there's a shareholder that wants to sell shares on the EquityZen platform and they're comfortable with a certain price, what we'd be very clear with them is that we're going to do our best to find a buyer for those shares. We may have somebody interested. They have not confirmed it yet. And we're going to do our best to help provide liquidity for that person, but we're not going to provide any assurances that that transaction will absolutely happen. Right? We're going to make our commitment that we have an aligned incentive here, right? That EquityZen does well if we can deliver this service to the selling shareholder, to the investor that wants to buy, and the company as well. So that's definitely one example. The other communication aspect is working with these private companies, right? EquityZen will only do a transaction if it's going to have company level approval. And sometimes it's easier to make money by skipping that step. As an example, there are these things called forward contracts. A forward contract is where a buyer says, oh, you have shares of Unicorn Corp. I talked to the company. The CEO of Unicorn Corp doesn't really want anybody to sell shares officially. So why don't you and I enter into this IOU, basically, this like very short contract that says, I'm going to give you $100,000 now. You guarantee that you'll give me $100,000 worth of shares at today's value in the future when the company goes public or gets bought. And so now Unicorn Corp's CEO has no idea that this transaction happened. And that's a disservice to the company, right? Not knowing who has an incentive in the company's performance and who's really on their ownership table, we think kind of deviates from the spirit of what that company was trying to do with liquidity. So that's kind of another area that, or a ground rule we put in place is like we don't do anything without knowing that we have company sign off.
Yeah. So you talk about the key decision to really only transact where the company is approving the transaction and is aware that the share transfer is taking place. How did you go about kind of having those conversations initially or building those relationships so that companies are comfortable working with EquityZen when it comes to the liquidity needs of their employees and their shareholders?
Yeah, so I'd say at EquityZen, we're kind of guided by three main principles. One is that transactions have to be fair for all three parties, right? We've got an investor that wants to buy shares, we've got a shareholder that wants liquidity, and we have a company that has, various incentives along the way as well. So kind of treating everybody fair across those three areas is super important. Number two, companies deserve to know what's going on with who owns their shares, how they were purchased, what price, et cetera. That means that each transaction has to be company approved. That's something that we have really impressed upon the whole space for the last 10 plus years. And the third one is really to treat customers like they're ourselves, right? We are advocating for them, but we're also talking about moving money around. And what you can't do when it comes to money is move fast and break things, right? So we need to be incredibly meticulous on how we run our transactions. Think about it as if it's, your aunt's money or your own money, right? Because ultimately what we're doing is really exciting. We're making this asset class available to a lot more people, but we're also touching people's money, right? And we need to be really, really careful there. And so those are kind of like guiding areas to make sure that we're running a business that we're really proud of, ultimately provides a service that was not there before and is something new, and end up getting rewarded for it.
So at EquityZen, I know we endearingly use the term team little check. Can you dive into that a little bit more and explain what that means and how it kind of fits into those principles?
Yeah, so Team Little Check is this idea that, in our space, when we started EquityZen, the only people that could invest in pre-IPO companies were people with tens of millions of dollars, right? It was, an institutional investor that could call up Sequoia or say like, I want to put money in. Great, that's nice for you. And what we really envisioned was that there were a ton of people that really wanted to invest, kind of like the long tail, if you will, that really wanted to invest less money. But when they found other alternatives, even over the last 10 years, like the best alternative they could find was something that was like $100,000 minimum. Or a lot of times a wealth manager would say that if you want to participate in this Uber pre-IPO offering, it's $250,000, right? And so EquityZen services customers as small as $10,000 and sometimes now $5,000. And our kind of joke about it is that a lot of other people consider that a little check, right? It's, only $5,000, it's only $10,000, not $250. But for us, Team Little Check is a group that really they're the biggest fans of our business, and we want to do everything we can for them to make sure that they have a chance to participate. So that's why we build more technology for them. That's why we work with as many companies as we can. That's why we continue to hire people so we can have new product offerings. They're kind of like the lifeblood of EquityZen, but also the direction we think that the market should go towards, right? It's what you've seen like historically in financial services. You wanted to invest in a mutual fund 60 years ago as an individual investor, it was next to impossible. And then those were kind of expensive. So then you had exchange traded funds, ETFs, right? And then brokerage all of a sudden cost zero, right? There was zero commissions on trades. So you can see these things take time to kind of find their way into the hands of Team Little Check. And what we just try to do is accelerate that as much as we can. So as far as kind of where we're going from here, it's more and more investment in the platform that we've built, the technology we've built to make this customer experience even better, right? Our goal is that the space is only 10 or 11 years old. We have a lot more wood to chop to make it feel as seamless to buy a share of pre-IPO stock as it is for you to click and buy a share of IBM stock on your Robinhood app, right? And we got a ways to go, and that's totally fine. But that's kind of our commitment and kind of our open call to people generally in the space is let's make this better and better and better because customers will love it. Companies will start to adapt it a bit more. And so that's where we're spending the time. The other part is we just continue to kind of advocate for the secondary markets, why we think it matters, why we think investment access for individual investors is super important, why we think liquidity for shareholders is super important for diversification, and why EquityZen has those tools to help kind of bring people into that level. A lot of people join EquityZen because it's a cool opportunity, but also because of the mission we have, right? Which is private markets for the public. That's where we want to bring things to. We've got a ways to go, made a little bit of progress. I kind of joke that every couple of years we maybe knock one of the zeros off the minimum that it required, right? So we started at tens of millions, and then we got it down to 1 million, then we got it to 100,000, now we've got it to 10,000. How do we get this to a point where it's somebody can put in $1,000 into it, assuming that it fits what they're trying to do, right? And how can somebody with $1,000 of shares of a private company get liquidity? That's where we kind of want to get to. And so everything is really in pursuit of that, which isn't any silver bullet that's going to get us there overnight. It's just going to be kind of day-to-day work and watching the benefits kind of compound over time. So my name is Phil Haslett. I'm co-founder and chief strategy officer at EquityZen. And if you'd like to learn more about what we do, if you'd like to look on how to invest, you can go to equityzen.com/investor. And if you're a shareholder looking for liquidity from a company, you can go take a look at equityzen.com/shareholder to find out more.